Someone said they're doing a biopic, a 4-part series about Cary Grant. Are you interested? And I went, absolutely fucking not. That's an insane thing to do. I have no interest in doing it. It's a poison chalice. And then they said, well, Jeff Pope's written it. And I went, well, that's just ridiculous. Why would he do that? And I thought for a second, I'm like, Jeff Pope? He's not an idiot. Why would he try and do a kind of biopic of the world's most famous and beloved movie star? So I had a look at the script, and of course it wasn't anything like that. I wouldn't play Cary Grant, but I'd play Archie Leach. Archie Leach is the guy he was when he stepped off screen. And off screen, he was a very troubled, very damaged, a man in enormous pain a lot of the time, who code switched and became whoever he thought he needed to be. And when I found out from the script and then subsequently from research that he had such a terrible start in life, such an abused, neglected, abandoned start in life, it made sense why he felt like he needed the whole world to love him, to try and fill up this hole inside him. And of course, what he found was the more the world loved him and the more he was placed on this pedestal, the more empty and hollow it felt. And the more all of the manifestations of that pain came out in ways that damaged his relationships, that gave him 5 marriages, and that caused him such distress that he spent his whole life seeking some remedy. You know, he took acid hundreds of times with the doctor, but he did a million other things as well to try and find some peace from the raging torrent in his head. And that, once I knew that was true, I thought, oh, that's a part I can play. You know, the first thing I did was watch all the films, obviously, and then I realized they were no help. Because if you were to do that, that's what Tony Curtis caricatured in Some Like It Hot. But he wasn't that. That was something he could do, he could turn on. He'd been an end-of-pier entertainer, he'd been a carnival barker, he'd been a vaudeville performer, he'd done comedy and sketches, but that wasn't who he was in his kitchen. That wasn't who he was when he was phoning Sophia Loren 12,000 times, when he phoned Diane every day for months to try, you know. He was the opposite of the suave lady killer. He was often a desperate and lonely and messed up guy. So it would be hard to caricature that. The thing to caricature would be the characters he played on screen. He played larger-than-life characters on screen, often because he'd been on big stages. You know, and those theatres in those days had 6,000 people in them when he was doing the vaudeville acts. But it was life-size, the script. He was a very, very complex man, but actually, as an actor, you very often get asked to play 2-dimensional parts. If you're very lucky, 2.5-dimensional parts. It's extremely rare that you get to play someone all of whose colours are displayed on screen and in the story, and whose best and worst sides you see. You know, I could do the whole 15 minutes or an hour on The Voice because I was terrified, obviously, even though I thought, well, this is an interesting, messed up human being, but people have expectations. And the thing they have the most expectations of, the look I can't control. They stuck things on me, they plastered, you know, there's hair and eyes and chin, but in the end, he was beautiful and I'm just me, but that's okay. But the voice is something that every mimic could do those days, every impressionist could do. And I was desperate to find some record of him having a conversation like this, an interview at least. Because there's nothing, there's just him in the films. And in the films, that's not the way a human being speaks. He's got a way, I don't mean the accent, I mean his music, the intonation pattern. It's all incredibly certain, all resolves in a major key, and it just, accents are music to me. And I couldn't find anything anywhere. I mean, I went to the archives of every television network around, obviously went to YouTube, and then it turns out, speaking to Diane, because he wouldn't give interviews. He didn't want people to see or hear who he really was. So that what you see him on screen is so carefully cultivated and rehearsed. And I was despairing, really. And then I read an interview somewhere, so I read everything I could find. It felt like a transcript. It didn't seem like it, felt like a transcript. So I tracked the guy down through various different social media things, eventually got him to speak to me, and I said, listen, I think you recorded that interview, and I'd love to hear it. He went, why would you say that? Why? And he got very defensive. And I said, I'm an actor, I'm not a journalist. I'm playing him, and I'm desperate to find out what he sounded like, what he really sounded like. And after much begging and persuading him, he very generously told me the story, which is that he had done an interview with him in 1986 as a student journalist, and he'd recorded it, and Cary Grant had told him not to record it. The first thing he said in the interview was, "You're not recording this, are you?" And he goes, "Well, I was going to." He goes, "Don't." Very firmly. But his friend was recording it, and he looked over at his friend and he said, oh, and his friend nodded. And at the end of the interview, his friend went, "I mean, I did record it, obviously." And he'd never played it to anyone. Very honorably, in 37 years, he never played it to anyone. And I begged him, and he played it to me, and that's the voice I got. The reason it's not a caricature is because he was much more English. He was much less, Cary Grant was a character who he played and adapted very mildly film to film. But Archie Leach didn't talk like that. I mean, remember, this is the guy in the last year of his life, and he's speaking to a 22-year-old kid, and he still was kind of bristled at being misunderstood and wanted to make his point. You could hear the old insecurity in there, and also how irrelevant and silly he thought acting was, and how much more comfortable he was being a businessman than an actor. I could hear just different speech patterns. I always thought, listening to the films, yeah, but what do you sound like if someone dropped a hot iron on your foot? Or what would you sound like then? Because it's so in control, so it's such a lot of machismo, yeah. And also, just what are you like when you're being misunderstood, or you want your wife or your daughter is just not doing the thing you want? And he was obviously a man who wanted to control everything. He had a terrible rage. When he had a temper, he had a terrible temper. And what I heard was all those different layers from over the years that I've been wanting to hear. And I used that as my voice role model. Jennifer had already told me he was much more English. She was always correcting her speech to make sure she sounded English. Even now, Jennifer sounds slightly anglicized, even all these decades later. So I knew he was more English than he sounded in the films. But I just heard speech patterns that told me so much about him. Well, it's easy. The obvious answer, and it's partly true, is that Hitchcock saw the dark side of him. Hitchcock saw saw him through all the marriages, and saw how impossible it was for him to hold on to relationships. Saw his obsession with people that would turn into, Sophia Loren threatened to get a restraining order against him. So Hitchcock saw his manipulation, his desire, his iron-like control to keep the world sane, to keep the wolves, the anarchy from the door of his mind. But I like His Girl Friday because he was relatively fresh from entertaining in those vaudeville shows and having to entertain 6,000 people, and the balcony is a long way away, and the madcap pace of the dialogue and the kind of physicality of it all. It's almost a Marx Brothers movie. I also like Father Goose because it was one of the only times, maybe one of the two times, he stepped outside of this very strict, almost straitjacket of the character he created that the world fell in love with. Not a lot of people saw Mass, which I think is a really, truly beautiful. It won the Robert Altman Award at the Independent Spirits, not last year, the year before. It's a beautiful film about the power of forgiveness, and the other actors are amazing, but also I just think the film itself is just a perfect, very powerful and emotional little film. I would recommend that. Well, there were a few more films that were reenacted in the initial script, and I was terrified. I was scared enough going into this, recognizing that people would think they were watching Cary Grant, or that they wonder, do that marking of scorecards like ice dancing, going, how close is he to Cary Grant? Well, the idea is not to be close to Cary Grant. I'm not trying to do an impression, and if you want to watch Cary Grant, you should watch the movies. So there were these bits of the movies, but it ended up being just 2 in the cut, I think, and only 1 that speaks. So it was very manageable. It was easy. I'm not a bad mimic, particularly when I've got a little section to mimic, and I can't look like him, but I think I got his voice down for that small section, for the screen version of his voice down, in a way that I wasn't totally ashamed of, which is a victory for me.